Thank you. Thank you so much. So the rest of the evening is, first, it's a scientific presentation. The research that I've done with Dr. Paul Thomas, and then we have a special guest that I think you'll all enjoy hearing a little bit about this special guest that we're going to talk about tonight at the end. It's a surprise guest. If you know who it is, don't tell your neighbor, because he's in trouble. Okay. So anyway, the IPAK Vaxxed versus Unvaxxed study came about in part because Paul Thomas was against the ropes. I first learned about Paul Thomas, of course, through his book, The Vaccine Friendly Plan. And I was at a meeting with Paul, and he had mentioned to me that the ethics board was coming after him. And the ethics board was investigating whether or not he was doing a bad thing by not vaccinating all of his patients to the CDC schedule. And so I wrote a letter. I said, would you mind if I wrote a letter to the chair of the ethics board that was investigating you? He said, sure, go ahead, I'll run it by my lawyer. And when I wrote the letter, I reminded the ethics board that under U.S. federal regulations governing human experiments and human experiments in the United States, not Nuremberg, human experiments, U.S. federal regulations. The regulations stipulate specifically that you may not coerce any human being on American soil in American experiments at all. And I reminded them that post-market surveillance studies, even though it's post-licensure, is still an open-end experiment without any control. There's no control group in the vaccinated people in the United States of America. They never asked me when I vaccinated or my ex vaccinated or brought my sons to the doctor, would you like to enroll your children in a post-market safety surveillance study? They call it pharmacovigilance. And I challenged these people to go back to their own practice to determine whether or not they might be the ones that are in violation of federal regulations. The lawyer read it, didn't really quite know what to make of it, and it was sent to the chair of the ethics committee. The ethics board dropped the charges against and stopped all inquiry against Paul Thomas, MD, because we had them. We had them. By asking them to examine their own medical practices in light of what they should well know, I didn't presume to ask a thing. I never asked them to do anything. I informed them because we know where we stand. Second, the Vaxxed study itself came about because then the medical board took to Paul like dogs. They took to Paul with accusations that they were cooking up, which are terrible and egregious. But nevertheless, they had asked for the following. Next slide, please. Michael Kazee, thank you. Are the vaccinated kids in the study, or in the practice, healthier or less healthy? That is, are the unvaccinated children in your practice less healthy than your vaccinated? We need to know this. This is what the medical board said. Well, we already knew that Anthony Moths and colleagues had shown these potential associations in this pilot study, which was a survey study. And survey studies are notoriously low-level evidence. Dr. Mawson will be the first to say that. That's why he correctly called it a pilot study. That's why Dr. Andrew Wakefield called his study a pilot study, because it really was kind of like, you know, it wasn't randomized. It wasn't a database that you went and pulled from. It was kind of a collection of data and observation. And that's the appropriate thing. And it's always puzzled me as a scientist. Why in the world? They say that Dr. Wakefield ever said anything about vaccines and autism when all he said was that these kids probably have gastroenteritis in a way that seems to, it possibly could be associated with the MMR vaccine. Oh, by the way, they all happen to have autism. That's all that Andrew Wakefield said. And he said it was a pilot study, and they retracted a pilot study. Imagine this level of evidence to get the little toe in the door to maybe ask the question, do vaccines cause autism, with a pilot study. Andrew Wakefield's study wasn't a large database study. It was a small pilot study. So Dr. Mawson wrote this study and did this study and found 30 times allergic rhinitis, 5.2 times learning disability, ADHD, 4.2 times, autism 4.2 times, neurodevelopmental disorders 3.7, eczema 2.9, chronic illness 2.4, and there's the unvaccinated, the healthiest that they've seen. Next slide, please. And of course, Brian Hooker and Neil Miller, they did this very nice study of children that were, I think it was 3 years and older, across 3 different practices. Now we're getting some real data. And they found all kinds of associations, not to the extent that Dr. Mawson's study did, but nevertheless, peer-reviewed study. And Paul Thomas, this came out while I was doing the analysis for Paul. Paul Thomas had asked me to take a look at the data because the board asked him to have a data quality check. They brought an MD in, a medical doctor in who's a data expert to make sure that there was high provenance between the data records in the practice and what the data quality expert said. Independent data quality, data draw. And I said, hey, you know, this looks like a retrospective study to me. What do you think? Sure. So I'm a biomedical research scientist with 20 years in biomedical research. I wrote a book, The Environmental and Genetic Causes of Autism. I have done extensive research on my own on the quality of the science that they call science on the questions of vaccines and autism, to the point where I think it's all garbage. And so I said, sure, I'll take a look at this. Next slide, please. This was the outcome of this. The title is Relative Incidence of Office Visits and Cumulative Rates of Bill Diagnosis Across the Axis of Vaccination. Next slide, please. This is Paul Thomas in his book, The Vaccine Friendly Plan. Paul just let me know last week that the reason why the medical board came after him wasn't because of anything that the ethics board said, but they came after him because he published this book. This book is so dangerous because it outlines a couple of things. Whenever you have the chance to skip aluminum-containing vaccines, skip them. That is, use non-aluminum-containing vaccines. Whenever you have the chance to make sure that you have a vaccine that a child doesn't need, you might want to have a conversation about whether that vaccine is essential or not, such as hepatitis B. Do you know, everybody knows, thanks to coronavirus, what R0 is. Did you know that R, that's the basic reproduction number, how fast a virus will spread or a bacterium will spread. Did you know that the percent coverage that's determined to be needed for herd immunity, or I didn't see there, it's determined, it's a function of percent coverage? There's an equation. So we know the R0, and the R0, the percent coverage is a function of R0. Do you know what the percent coverage is necessary for hepatitis B, given its R0 in the pediatric population? What percentage of the population do you think you have to vaccinate to protect people? It's 0. The R0 is so small. It's non-existent. Next slide, please. So this was the data draw that was done. We had 21,000 records to begin with. We got rid of Mickey Mouse. There were test patients. There were 21,000 actual patients. The date of birth was a specific range over 10.5 years. If they're outside of the range, they're excluded. The first visit before 60 days was to make sure that we didn't have somebody coming into the practice who already had 2 months of vaccine in the unvaccinated. And then the last visit after 60 days was to make sure that this person was around long enough that they did get proposed to be vaccinated. Here's the vaccine schedule you might want to think about by Dr. Paul Thomas. And we ended up with a cohort of 3,324. Now, this is a representative sample that makes sure a number of things. They're born into the cohort. They're not. They didn't come from outside the practice. They're born into the practice. And their first discussions with Paul Thomas were about vaccines with Paul Thomas. Next slide, please. This is the outcome in terms of the vaccination rate. We have 561 patients in that cohort that are unvaccinated, and we have 2,763 that are variably vaccinated. There's so much variation in vaccine uptake because some families take some vaccines, some take others, some don't vaccinate, very, very much at all. But there's also age variation there. So some of the younger kids only have a few, and the older ones, who's 10.5 years there, have more. None of the patients in this cohort are CDC vaccinated. I think the patients in this cohort are about halfway vaccinated if you're talking about CDC compliance, okay? So he really talks about the vaccine information sheets. He talks about the product inserts. He looked for things like you're not making your language development, you've had a seizure, anything like that. And he talks with the patients. The patients are then given the chance, as required by Oregon state law, to refuse a vaccine if they choose not to take it up. So he's following state law, and I call that lay law, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Next slide, please. Now, there's something very interesting I noticed in the data, which we had an opportunity, the first ever that I'm aware of, which was we had a positive control. We had data on fever. It is unambiguously known that fevers are caused by vaccines. There's no one who will ever debate that. So if you look at the 5th percentile vaccine uptake to the 95th percentile vaccine uptake, the kids that have had more vaccines and that do vaccinate more have more fever. No problem. That's a causal relationship. So if we see this kind of pattern in the data, that positive control tells us, look, the data can pick out a known cause. And they have beaten us back and beaten us back and beaten us back all the time by saying observational studies, you can't infer causality. Correlation doesn't provide sufficient evidence for causality. And that's true. But we also have a negative control here, which is the well child visit. I used the well child visits to see if the vaccinated kids, who are only 5th% vaccinated, are getting the same amount of well child visit care, right, where he talks about vaccines with them, as the most vaccinated. And guess what? These are relative to unvaccinated. Each one of these is a ratio of the office visits, billed office visits, of these patients to come in just to see how your kid's doing. That's the well child visit. That's a negative control. There's never been an observational study in vaccines that have a positive control and a negative control. So guess what we found? Regardless of vaccine uptake, they're all coming in to say hello to Dr. Paul, get the head circumference taken, get your baby weight, have a conversation, how are they doing, are they making the milestones? By the way, here's a CDC chart. This is what the CDC says that you should do today. Now let's talk about vaccines. He doesn't take 7 minutes. His patients love him. And an argument against our study is that, well, maybe these granola crunching moms, they just don't bother to come to the doctor. And this is one of the checks on that. These granola crunching moms are coming to see Paul. In fact, that's the reason why they're coming to see Paul. They trust Paul. He's had more families come into the practice than any other practice in Oregon because they know that they can come into the practice and he will respect their choice. Next slide, please. This is a busy chart, but basically this is the quartile of vaccine uptake with the end on the left side being the unvaccinated with a whole bunch of health outcomes. And what you can see here basically is that if we look at the data for different kinds of health outcomes, and the more vaccinated the kids are, the more they're going to the doctor for billed office visits related to asthma, allergic rhinitis, sinusitis, ADHD, behavioral issues, ear pain, otitis media, anemia, eczema, all over, gastroenteritis, weight and eating disorder, seizure, speech. The speech, social, and learning disorders are difficult to study because there's so few. He has about, I think the number is, he has less than half the rate of autism compared to the national average, okay? The national rate in his entire practice. So there's just so small numbers. But if you look at autism, next slide, please. If we look at autism up close, which is the quarter panel there's something very interesting that happens with autism. With autism, again, these are the relative incidence of office visits compared to unvaccinated. Autism is the fourth panel there on the right. In the first quartile, you have this amount of office visits. In the second quartile, you have this amount of office visits. It looks like it's going up, like there's maybe a potential correlation with vaccination. In the third and the fourth quartile of autism, it drops to nothing. And that's because when he starts seeing signs of autism of any kind, delayed speech patterns, delayed eye contact, the mom's worried about it, anything at all, plus a family history of autoimmunity. This is key. He always asks the patients, do you have a family history of autoimmunity? And if you do, we want to talk about ways that vaccines might cause problems with the immune system. Okay? So he's actually preventing autism in his practice. That's the signature of informed consent right there in that fourth panel. It's a little bit buried in our paper, but it's there. Next slide, please. This figure is very popular. It just blows the mind to look at it because what this is is the day of life of the children on the x-axis from day 1 until 10.5 years. And it looks green. What color is the top curve to you guys there? Red. Thank you. I'm red-green colorblind. So from where I sit, it looks just like green. But the red on the top is the cumulative number of office visits for the 2,764 vaccinated people, the kids. And the blue is the number of office visits related to that health condition for the 561 unvaccinated. Now you're going to say, of course, Dr. Jack, look, there's only 561 unvaccinated, so the lower curve is going to be lower. That's the expected curve if there were 2,764 unvaccinated. Okay, so I've done that calculation, I've done that adjustment. And what do we see here? We see asthma, allergic rhinitis, breathing issues, behavioral issues, ADHD. We're going to talk a little bit about ADHD in a minute. Respiratory infection, otitis media, ear pain, infection, eye disorders, conjunctivitis, eye disorders, other, eczema, dermatitis, urticaria, and anemia. We're going to talk a lot about anemia. Next slide, please. ADHD. There are 561 patients in this cohort. You saw how we selected to keep them in or exclude. It had nothing to do with whether they were diagnosed with ADHD. It had to do with how long they were in the practice, were they warranted in practice. What's up? What's that say, Nadra? Oh, I'm going to have to kick it up. Okay, so there are 0 cases of ADHD in the 561 unvaccinated. 0 cases. And if you look at the least vaccinated compared to the most vaccinated here, there's 55 times the amount of office visits in the most vaccinated compared to the least vaccinated of ADHD. Next slide, please. Anemia. If you see anemia, that's a screen that happens at a particular age. Next slide, please. Anemia, I believe, is being caused here because aluminum binds to transferrin. Next slide. Transferrin is a protein that actually your body uses to take dietary iron from your diet and put it in the bone to make red blood cells. If your baby's trying to make their brain and they can't oxygenate their brain processes, you're starving the brain if you don't have enough red blood cells. And so I believe that the anemia is a signature that's going to be key to understanding a lot of these chronic illnesses in neurodevelopment. Next slide, please. So we've done a lot of other studies at IPAK. We've done, we established here, for instance, next slide, the first ever pediatric dose limit of aluminum in vaccines, where we, given the body weight of a child, what is a safe, quote unquote, pediatric dose limit of vaccines? I'm not saying aluminum is safe. I'm saying the FDA never published it. They never bothered to say, they said 850 microgram is safe for an adult. They never bothered to say what's safe for a child, so we determined that, not empirically with experiments, we did it mathematically, given their adult, and we scaled it to children using a standard toxicological model. Next slide, please, based on body weight. We then bothered to compare the 3 schedules that we had. We had CDC schedule, we had the vaccine-friendly plan, and then we had another schedule that we wanted to, we just came up with it. That seemed it might even be better than the vaccine-friendly plan. Next slide, please. And there's the pediatric dose limit. There's the adult limit that they say is safe at 850. I don't have time to go into how they determined it. It's bogus how they determined 850, but that's not my problem. That's theirs. Next slide, please. These are the 3 schedules that we compared. If you want these, you don't have to take pictures of everything. I'll just send you the slides. Nadra can send them to you if you write to her. Next slide, please. We found 15 times over the scale limit, 15.9 times over the pediatric dose limit under CDC schedule. We found just 4.2 times. The number of days, next slide please, in the first 7 months of life that a child is in aluminum toxicity under the CDC schedule, 70% of their days was this estimate under CDC schedule. They were in aluminum toxicity, 5% of the days under the vaccine-friendly plan. So this probably explains a lot of the reason why we see the health differences. Next slide, please. Go back one, sorry. What this shows is, this actually shows the aluminum doses and their clearance under the 3 plans, and you can see we just calculated the area under the curve. Next slide, please. This shows the 70% and the 5% for the vaccine-friendly plan and our modified. Didn't turn out to be better, it was intermediate. From the first 7 months of life from birth to 2 years. In 1 out of every 4 days, birth to 2 years, we estimated. But one thing that we missed here was that kidneys don't develop to full function until 2 years of age. So we didn't correct for that in this study, which we did in our next study. Next slide, please. This one, where we looked at the impact of the CDC catch-up schedule, given that kids have been locked out from going to the doctor for so long, what happens if they show up and they get 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 vaccines at a time? So we published this in 2020. While they're doing all their lockdowns and everything, IPAK's busy doing science. Next slide, please. And this is our model for the pediatric dose limit adjustment, given that the kids' kidneys are just developing up to 2 years, and they can't clear the aluminum. Next slide, please. And what we showed here was that 100% of the days in a child's life, in the first years of life, once you correct for the kidney, the kids are in aluminum toxicity, 365 out of 365 days if you follow the CDC schedule. So that, I think, explains a lot of this. Next slide, please. This just shows, I'm just showing off now that we have the ability to take any child at any age, and we were able to project over time what's going to happen in terms of their aluminum clearance if you're going to choose this schedule or that schedule. And we want to build a phone app. Next slide, please. A phone app so that any parent anywhere can ask these questions and get these answers and determine for the next 60 days or next year how many days are my children going to be in aluminum toxicity if they take this or that schedule. Next slide, please. This is all rational. That's the CDC plan. That's the modified plan, and that's Paul's plan. So there's still acute toxicity, and he says there's still too much aluminum in his schedule. Next slide, please. So we did this publication. They haven't come after it for retraction yet, but they will. They came after one of our aluminum studies for retraction, the modeling that we did. We fought it, and we won. They're not going to retract that study. Next slide, please. So this hopefully will be here to stay. It's definitely going to have an impact. There's going to be T-shirts developed that have the Doug and Rashawn Golden. They're going to put the T-shirts together so you can go to your meetings, you can go to your family, you can say, scan this in your phone and go to the study. And so we're going to do that kind of guerrilla marketing. Next slide, please. One of the most important things that I did, and I want you guys to understand this, is that this new method of the relative incidence of office visit is the general form of a test that they use all the time. They use a specific form of the test called odds ratio of incidence, where they're only looking at, hey, do you have at least one office visit billed for autism? We're counting the number of times you have to come to the doctor for autism. It has a higher dynamic range, it's more sensitive, and our simulation shows that it's more powerful. Next slide, please. Powerful means we're able to detect problems if it's there. So I want you to check out Paul Thomas's vaccine-friendly plan, please. And next slide, please. Also check out Bernadette Pager's urgent open letter to the Oregon Medical Board, because 5 days after we published our study, the Oregon Medical Board suspended Paul's license without a hearing. 5 days. We're meeting them blow for blow. He's not backing down. Next slide, please. This is the first in a series of videos where I'm interviewing people that are writing articles in defense of Paul Thomas. Blow for blow, accusation by accusation. Bernadette Pager works at the Informed Choice Washington. It's in my podcast, which is Unbreaking Science. And kids beware, I drop a few F-bombs here in this video. Next slide, please.
Shocking.
You can help Paul Thomas by going to this website, Freedom to Choose, in his legal fight, because although his license has been suspended, he owns the practice, and he's got 10,000 kids that need that practice to stay open. So please check out, next slide, please. This is the URL, paulthomasmd.com/freedomtochoose.html. So thank you very much. James Linesweiler, IPAK.